May 15, 1945. Glucksburg Castle, Germany. The morning was clear and cool. Through the castle windows, Paul Nitze could see the Flensburg fjord in the distance, its waters calm despite the chaos that had consumed Europe for 6 years. He sat across a wooden table from the man who had kept Nazi Germany's war machine running for 3 years while Allied bombs rained down on every major industrial city in the Reich. Albert Speer was 40 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit despite being a prisoner of war. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his posture perfect, his expression composed, almost relaxed. There was no swagger, no defiance, just quiet calculation behind his eyes. Nitze was 38, a former investment banker from Wall Street who had traded high finance for government service when his mentor James Forrestal called him to Washington in 1940. Now he was vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. He had one question that mattered more than all the others. But first, he needed Speer to trust him, or at least to believe that cooperation served his interests better than silence. The war in Europe had ended 8 days earlier. On May 7, Germany had signed the instrument of unconditional surrender at Reims, France. Adolf Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30 as Soviet artillery pounded the streets above. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, had formed what he optimistically called a government in Flensburg and pretended Germany still existed as a sovereign nation. It did not. Germany was a corpse. The question now was what lessons the living could extract from examining that corpse before its enemies divided the remains. American forces had arrived in Flensburg on May 15. The race to interrogate Speer was over. Nitze got there first. The United Nations War Crimes Commission wanted Speer in chains, wanted him tried alongside Goering and the other Nazi leaders. But Nitze needed him talking first. The Pacific War was still raging. American bombers were hitting Japanese cities with the same systematic fury they had unleashed on Germany. Tokyo had burned. Osaka had burned. Nagoya had burned. But nobody knew if it would work, if strategic bombing alone could force Japan to surrender without the nightmare of a ground invasion. Estimates for invading the Japanese home islands predicted 500,000 American casualties, perhaps more. Strategic bombing had to work. It had to force capitulation without American soldiers fighting through every city, every village, every mountain fortress that Japanese commanders would defend to the last man. But first, the Americans needed to understand what had actually worked against Germany, and only one man in the world knew the complete answer: Speer. Nitze had been chasing this interrogation for weeks. The Strategic Bombing Survey had been established in November 1944 by Secretary of War Henry Stimson following a directive from President Franklin Roosevelt. The mission was straightforward on paper: determine what effect strategic bombing had on Germany's ability to wage war, document the successes and failures, use those lessons in the Pacific. Nitze had assembled a formidable team. John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist who would later become famous as a Harvard professor, was sitting in the room with him at Glucksburg. George Ball, who would serve as Undersecretary of State in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, had been leading teams across Germany for months, examining bombed factories, interviewing shell-shocked industrialists, studying production records salvaged from facilities that Allied bombs had turned into rubble. But Speer was the prize, the keystone that would make sense of all the other interviews, all the documents, all the bomb damage assessments. Speer had run the entire German war economy since February 1942, when he took over the Ministry of Armaments following the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt, in an aircraft accident. For 3 years, Speer had controlled every factory, every supply chain, every labor allocation decision from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow. If anyone knew whether strategic bombing had worked, whether it had crippled German production or merely inconvenienced it, whether the entire bloody expensive campaign had been worth the cost in aircraft and air crews. It was Speer. The problem was that Speer knew he was valuable. He had watched other Nazi leaders in the final weeks of the war. Some had committed suicide like Hitler and Goebbels. Some had fled and were being hunted like animals. Some had been captured and were already being prepared for trial. Speer had calculated his odds carefully. His name was not as infamous as Goering's or Himmler's. He had not given speeches calling for extermination. He had not run concentration camps. He was the technocrat, the architect, the production genius who had kept Germany fighting years longer than anyone thought possible. If he played this correctly, if he made himself indispensable to the Americans, if he told them what they wanted to know about strategic bombing, maybe they would protect him from the hangman's noose. So Speer had already decided his strategy before Nitze asked the first question: full cooperation, total transparency. He would tell the Americans everything they wanted to know about German war production, about the effects of strategic bombing, about Hitler's final days, about the collapse of the Reich's economy. Everything except the one subject that could get him hanged, his knowledge of and complicity in the Holocaust. That topic was forbidden territory. Nitze understood this calculation immediately. He could see it in how Speer leaned forward slightly when questions touched on technical matters of production and bombing effectiveness. He could see how Speer's expression closed down like a vault door slamming shut whenever topics approached moral questions. Nitze made a tactical decision. He would ask about factories, not atrocities, about production numbers, not slave labor, about bomb damage to industrial plants, not extermination camps. Get the information the survey needed. Leave the war crimes questions for the prosecutors at Nuremberg. Nitze's job was narrower and more immediate. Figure out what strategic bombing accomplished. Use that knowledge to end the war in the Pacific before more Americans died. For 7 days, from May 15 through May 21, Nitze and his team questioned Speer 5 hours per day, sometimes extending into the evening when Speer was particularly forthcoming. Each morning, Speer would arrive at the interrogation room in that same well-tailored suit, pleasant, cooperative, occasionally offering insights and documents the Americans had not even thought to request. He walked them through what he called bombing high school, the education of conquerors in how a nation survives and ultimately fails to survive under total air war. Speer began with the production statistics, the numbers that had made him famous in the Nazi hierarchy as the miracle worker who kept the war machine running. When he took over the armaments ministry in February 1942, Germany was producing approximately 15,000 aircraft per year. By 1944, production had reached 39,807 aircraft. Tank and self-propelled gun production had climbed from approximately 4,900 in 1941 to around 27,000 in 1944. Ammunition production had more than doubled. Artillery pieces, submarines, trucks, small arms all showed similar dramatic increases. The armaments miracle, they called it. Nitze listened to these figures with intense concentration, taking careful notes. The numbers were impressive. They were also confusing. Something fundamental did not add up. Germany had been under sustained Allied bombing since May 1942, when the Royal Air Force launched its first 1,000-bomber raid, hitting Cologne with unprecedented force. American daylight precision bombing had joined the campaign in August 1942. By mid-1943, the combined bomber offensive was hitting German cities and industrial facilities around the clock. RAF Bomber Command flew night area raids designed to destroy residential areas. The United States Army, Air Forces flew daylight precision raids targeting specific industrial facilities. Tens of thousands of bombers had dropped millions of tons of explosives on Germany. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden had been turned into funeral pyres. Berlin was a landscape of rubble, yet German production had tripled under Speer's leadership. How? Speer explained the defensive measures in detail, speaking like a professor lecturing students. Dispersal of production, moving critical manufacturing to small workshops scattered across the countryside. Transfer of entire facilities to underground locations, converted mines, railway tunnels, anywhere that offered protection from bombs. Ruthless prioritization of resources, cutting civilian production to zero to free up materials and labor for war goods. Redundancy in supply chains, ensuring that if one factory was destroyed, others could increase output to compensate. Improved industrial processes developed by German engineers working under the pressure of constant bombing. Exploitation of forced labor from occupied territories, millions of workers brought to Germany against their will. But then Speer mentioned something that made Nitze stop writing and look up from his notes. A date, May 12, 1944. Speer said he would never forget that date. On that day, 935 American heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force struck German synthetic oil production facilities in central and eastern Germany. The primary target was the Luna synthetic oil plant near Merseburg, Germany's single largest producer of aviation gasoline. Speer said that attack changed everything. Until May 12, Germany had managed to produce approximately as many weapons as the armed forces needed despite considerable losses to Allied bombing. After May 12, everything began to collapse. The armaments miracle was over. The war was effectively lost, though it would take another 11 months of fighting and hundreds of thousands more deaths before Germany surrendered. Nitze made careful notes. This was the critical insight he had come to find. Not tanks, not aircraft, not ball bearings, oil, fuel. The substance that made every weapon system mobile and operational. Speer continued. After the May attacks on oil production, Germany's monthly output of synthetic fuel dropped catastrophically. In April 1944, Germany had produced 316,000 tons of aviation gasoline and other petroleum products. By July, production had fallen to 107,000 tons. By September, it had collapsed to less than 50,000 tons. The attacks continued. American heavy bombers returned to the synthetic oil plants again and again. Whenever German workers repaired damage and restarted production, more bombers arrived. The refineries became the most heavily defended targets in Germany, ringed with anti-aircraft guns, protected by fighter squadrons diverted from other fronts. Nothing helped. The Americans kept coming. By December 1944, German fuel production was what Speer called catastrophic. The Luftwaffe could not fly. Pilot training was curtailed because there was not enough gasoline to keep training aircraft airborne. German jet fighters, technologically superior to any Allied fighter, could not be deployed effectively because there was not enough fuel for training pilots. Panzer divisions could not move. When Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German planners allocated barely enough fuel for the attacking divisions to reach their initial objectives. The operational plan explicitly counted on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain the offensive. When that capture failed, entire panzer formations ran out of gasoline and had to be abandoned. Nitze pressed for more details about other bombing targets. What about the famous raids on Schweinfurt, the city that produced most of Germany's ball bearings? Speer smiled slightly. Ball bearings, he explained, had never been the bottleneck the Americans believed they were. Germany had stockpiled months of supply before the raids. When production at Schweinfurt dropped, German engineers substituted simpler bearings. They imported bearings from Sweden and Switzerland. The attacks on Schweinfurt had cost Germany production capacity certainly, but they had not crippled anything. Meanwhile, those raids had cost the Americans irreplaceable heavy bombers and experienced crews. What about attacks on aircraft production facilities? Speer explained that aircraft production had peaked in 1944, the highest of the entire war. How was that possible if Allied bombers were systematically attacking aircraft factories? Factories were dispersed. Production was moved to underground facilities. Assembly was broken into smaller steps performed in workshops that were difficult to target. The problem was not production. The problem was fuel. "You can build all the fighters you want," Speer said, "but if you cannot fuel them, cannot train pilots to fly them, they are useless." Germany produced thousands of aircraft in 1944 that never flew a single combat mission. Nitze was beginning to see the pattern emerge. Strategic bombing had not failed. It had succeeded, but only where it targeted the one thing Germany could not replace, could not substitute, could not work around: oil. Everything else Speer had found solutions for, but oil was finite. Germany had virtually no natural petroleum reserves. The Reich depended entirely on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline through complex chemical processes. When those plants were destroyed, there was no alternative. On the afternoon of May 18, 3 days into the interrogation, Nitze shifted topics. He asked Speer about American industrial capacity. What did German leadership understand about American production capability before the war? Speer paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that in the early years of the war, from 1939 through 1941, Hitler and the German High Command did not take American industrial capacity seriously. They viewed America as weak, divided, isolationist. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that America would produce 50,000 aircraft, German military advisors dismissed these figures as propaganda. Impossible numbers, they said. The numbers were not fantasy. They were underestimates. By the time Speer took over the Armaments Ministry in February 1942, intelligence reports reaching Berlin suggested American production was far beyond anything Germany could match. In 1941, the United States had produced approximately 19,000 combat aircraft. In 1942, that number reached roughly 48,000. In 1943, approximately 86,000. In 1944, approximately 96,000. Speer stopped speaking for a moment. Nitze waited. Then Speer said the words that Nitze would remember for the rest of his life. He said that when he finally saw the complete American production statistics in late 1943, he understood with absolute certainty that Germany had already lost the war. Not because of any battle or campaign, but because Germany's industrial capacity was eclipsed by overwhelming American material superiority. There was no scenario, no possible strategy, no wonder weapon that could overcome such a massive disparity in production. Nitze asked for more specifics. Total American aircraft production from 1941 to 1945 exceeded 300,000 planes. Germany produced approximately 119,000. American tank production exceeded 88,000. Germany produced approximately 49,000. The United States built approximately 2,700 major naval vessels. Germany built fewer than 100 major surface warships. But it was not just the absolute quantity. It was the speed, the rate of production, the staggering pace at which American factories turned out finished weapons. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo vessels, faster than German submarines could sink them. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan produced B-24 Liberator heavy bombers at a rate of 1 complete aircraft every 63 minutes. One bomber, with more than 1.5 million individual parts, rolling off an assembly line every hour. Germany had nothing comparable. German aircraft production was still based on skilled craftsmen carefully assembling components. American production was based on mass manufacturing principles, interchangeable parts, assembly line techniques, perfected in the automotive industry. Speer said he had tried to reorganize German industry along American mass production principles. He achieved remarkable production gains. German output tripled under his leadership, but every gain was meaningless. Germany was sprinting on a treadmill. For every increase Speer achieved, American production increased by a larger absolute number. But there was something else. America was not just producing weapons for itself. Under the Lend-Lease program, American factories were supplying military equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Free France, and every other nation fighting the Axis powers. By 1944, American industry was producing approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the war. And America was doing this while simultaneously raising an army of over 12 million men, maintaining a two-ocean navy, conducting strategic bombing campaigns in both theaters, and somehow still increasing civilian consumption at home. American gross national product grew by 52% between 1939 and 1944. The war did not impoverish America. It enriched the nation. Speer told Nitze that this was what German military intelligence had failed to understand in 1939. German analysts saw American isolationism, political divisions, economic problems, and concluded that the United States would not be a significant factor. They were wrong. America fought a two-front global war and overwhelmed both opponents simultaneously. Nitze asked when German leadership realized the true scale of American production capacity. Speer said it became undeniable by mid-1943. That was when the tide turned everywhere at once. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be built. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was using American trucks and supplies to sustain offensives. In North Africa, American forces had landed with overwhelming material superiority. And over Germany, American bomber formations were appearing in greater numbers every week. Speer said there was a moment in late 1943 when he considered approaching Hitler with the truth, that Germany could not win, that American production made victory mathematically impossible, that the war should be ended through negotiation, while Germany still had leverage. But Speer did not have the courage to speak those words. Hitler still believed in wonder weapons that would reverse Germany's fortunes. Speer knew none of these weapons would matter. You cannot win a war with technological advantages when the enemy is producing conventional weapons at 10 times your rate. But he kept that knowledge to himself and kept the factories running. On May 23, British and American military police arrested Speer aboard the ship Patria. He was transferred through a series of detention facilities, eventually arriving at Nuremberg, where the International Military Tribunal would try him alongside 23 other senior Nazi leaders. Nitze moved on. He compiled his findings into reports. The Strategic Bombing Survey would eventually publish its conclusions in September 1945, over 200 volumes for the European theater alone. The essential findings were clear. Strategic bombing had been decisive in defeating Germany, but not in the ways pre-war airpower theorists had predicted. The attacks on German civilian morale had largely failed. The attacks on ball-bearing production, on many of the precision targets that Allied planners thought were critical, had achieved limited results. Germany had worked around those losses through dispersal, redundancy, and substitution. But the campaign against oil had worked. The systematic destruction of synthetic fuel plants from May 1944 onward had crippled the Wehrmacht. Without fuel, Germany's military effectiveness dropped by approximately 80% in the final months of the war. The survey estimated that the oil campaign had shortened the war in Europe by months and had saved countless Allied lives. Nitze took those lessons to Japan. He was reassigned to the Pacific Strategic Bombing Survey in July 1945. He arrived in Nagasaki in September, shortly after atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The interrogation of Speer shaped American defense policy for decades. Nitze would serve in nearly every presidential administration from Truman through Reagan. He helped design the Marshall Plan. He was the principal author of NSC 68, the foundational document of Cold War containment strategy. He negotiated arms control treaties with the Soviet Union. He spent 40 years at the highest levels of American national security decision-making. But he never forgot what Speer told him in May 1945, that modern wars between industrial powers are ultimately won by the side with greater productive capacity. That material superiority, when sufficiently overwhelming, determines outcomes more reliably than strategy or tactics or courage. That America's ability to outproduce any rival was its greatest strategic advantage. Albert Speer was convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and crimes against humanity, primarily for his use of slave labor in armaments factories. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment at Spandau prison. He served his full sentence and was released on October 1, 1966. He published 2 memoirs that became international bestsellers and maintained his carefully constructed image as the apolitical technocrat who had been seduced by Hitler's charisma but had remained fundamentally decent. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, when historians gained access to documents Speer had hidden, did the full truth emerge. He had extensive knowledge of the Holocaust. His entire post-war story was a carefully constructed lie designed to evade the death penalty and rehabilitate his reputation. Speer died in London on September 1, 1981, at age 76. Nitze died on October 19, 2004, at age 97. The Strategic Bombing Survey reports remain in archives, studied occasionally by military historians and defense analysts. Modern strategic analysts still debate what defeated Germany. Every factor contributed, but Speer told Nitze the answer in May 1945. Germany lost because American production exceeded German production by ratios that made German defeat inevitable. 21 in aircraft, nearly 21 in tanks, overwhelming superiority in trucks, artillery, ammunition, every category of military equipment. This was the revelation that Paul Nitze carried from Glucksburg Castle in May 1945. Not just that strategic bombing worked when it targeted oil, but that industrial capacity is the foundation of military power in modern warfare. America had demonstrated a form of economic power that no rival could match. The core findings of the Strategic Bombing Survey remain relevant today. Target resources that cannot be replaced. Understand that civilian morale is more resilient than theorists believed. Recognize that industrial dispersal can overcome even heavy bombing. Accept that modern warfare is ultimately a contest of industrial capacity. This was what Nitze learned from 7 days of interrogation in May 1945. Germany could not win because America's material superiority was mathematically insurmountable. Speer had known this since late 1943, and when he told Nitze that knowledge shaped 4 decades of American defense policy.